You're listening to INTERZONE Pod. My name is Gareth Jelley. I'm the editor of INTERZONE, and today I'm talking to Gerardo Sámano Córdova, author of MONSTRILIO. So, hello, Gerardo Sámano Córdova. Thank you very much for coming on INTERZONE Pod today.
Thank you so much for having me.
MONSTRILIO is a very special novel, and I've also been enjoying some of your short stories and want to read more.
Oh, thank you.
But before we get to the writing, I just wanted to kind of start with you. In his LA Times review, a really great review, Gabino Iglesias says that New York City is in MONSTRILIO's heart, but it's also Mexican to the core. And I wondered sort of how would you describe yourself in terms of place in your heart and to your core?
Yeah, that's a great question, and also kind of a little bit difficult to answer. But so I was born in Mexico, and I grew up in Mexico City mostly. But then I did university college in New York State, and then I came to live in New York City, and so and then years later I went back to Mexico City, but for like the first years of my like adulthood, I guess I was in New York City, and so for me it was like a very formative time. And so for me, Mexico and New York hold special but different places in how I grew up and how I kind of developed myself. So obviously Mexico has a lot to do with my identity, but also New York, and Mexico is kind of how like I unwittingly grew up, because you don't choose where you're born, right?
Right.
And I love so much about Mexico, but New York was more of a choice. And I think so it like a part of Mexico is who I am or who I grew up to be, and New York kind of like represents a parts of who I wanted to be, or more of an image, or like the combination of both now, of who I think I am now, if that makes sense at all.
It does. And I mean, did it sort of, is that something that it took you sort of, as you were growing up, that it took you a while to sort of, to get to grips with?
Yeah. I think it in different ways, because a lot of people, I mean, I don't, like I never felt myself like as 100% part of any place, really. Like even growing up in Mexico, I felt different, or like I didn't fully belong. And obviously coming here to the US, you're still treated like by the government, all the institutions, like as an immigrant, right? And so you never really belong. But like I guess I started to feel belonging with people more than place, with like the people that I felt comfortable with and I felt that were kind of akin to me. And so for me, belonging became more about the people that I've met in different places rather than the place itself. But I think places like New York and Mexico City, especially when I was in Mexico City as an adult, I discovered those groups of people that kind of like made me feel like I belonged.
Mm-hmm. I was reading your interview with Yeji Y. Ham for Bomb magazine. I think that was maybe a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
And you say in that, you said something really interesting. You said that you find it impossible to extricate the fantastical from your work. And you say it seems to seep in no matter what. For me, it's a personal preference, but also the way I grew up in a culture that is happily prone to include the fantastical in regular existence. And I wondered if you could talk about that, sort of growing up and kind of what that really means, because I think that's a kind of good way of leading into talking about some of your stories and the book.
Yeah, and so in like a more literature type of way, I think it means that a lot of what I read when I was growing up was Latin American literature, and a lot of Latin American literature has fantastical elements in it, or at least the parts that I read. But I think there is obviously like a tradition of magical realism and all of this in Latin American literature where like, for example, if you read 100 Years of Solitude or Pedro Páramo or things like that, they're considered like masterpieces of literature, especially in Latin America. And they're all kind of like in weird spaces or in like non-realist spaces in different ways. And so when I was growing up and reading all of these things, I just thought literature was like that, right? Like it had to be like that. It couldn't be like realist, because why would it be, right? It's fiction. And so, and also like in everyday life, you get together and there's conversations where like people talk about seeing like their grandmother, they came to them in their dream, or maybe they were like standing at the room's door, or and so like you have like this connection to ghosts and the dead and other sort of like supernatural things that it's fun to talk about, but it's also in a way that it's not just like a fantasy. It's something that you kind of like accept as part of like something that you don't know about the world, right? Like it could happen, right? So it's there's this feeling, at least for me, or like my family, or like the people I grew up around with, that these types of things, even if you're not gonna go out there and scream like ghosts exist or something like that, it's just like part of your existence, right? Like your loved ones, your past loved ones, or things like that exist, right? Or there are haunted houses, or you see like balls of fire like traveling in your house, or things like that that people like just talk about. And even though some of them are scary, there's kind of like a certain acceptance that those things are real, and that we don't know everything that there is to know,
right,
about things.
You mentioned kind of, New York, and you studied film and photography. I think in New York, right?
Yeah, in New York State, in Ithaca, New York, Ithaca College. Yeah,
and as there's a great interview from last year with Emily Everett, the managing editor of The Common,
right.
And you talk about how kind of each voice in the world is unique, and about how when someone else has a different experience of a thing or a feeling, and I love this bit, you said that the world expands, which is a great way to put it. And I wondered sort of how did your time studying photography sort of shape you as an artist, and also how did it change the way you see the world, on top of what you've already described?
Yeah, absolutely. So, so when I studied film and photography because I wanted to be an artist, and I thought that would be like a cool way to be an artist, or like a good practice for an artist. And I love film. I continue loving film. I don't know if I love making it as much as I love watching it these days, also because of like the collaborative nature of it. It's just more difficult, and the money and all of that. But with photography, I think when I studied that, it expanded me in the way that I kind of saw the world differently, or like like it really taught me how to look at and talk about art, or what it could be. It really, there's like in photography, right? Like they teach you when you look into a camera to not just focus on like the thing, like a main thing, right? Like, but to look all over the frame, right? Like to move your eye to all the edges of the frame so that you know exactly what the composition is and what you're getting into the picture. And so I keep thinking about that even when I'm writing, like to look at all the edges of the frame to see what's there and if there's something interesting and valuable in those edges. So in terms of art, that really helped me kind of like think about things. Also, like thinking about how you put like a photography exhibition together and like the spaces that are between pictures and how that negative space kind of like relates to, or like it's a space for viewers to kind of like put their own experiences or their own thoughts in between the pictures. And that I also think a lot about in my writing, in what you don't say is also as important as what you do say. And so that also resonates a lot with me. So I think in terms of artistic practice, it helps so much just to have those ideas or just to look at film and photography in like in a more in-depth way has really helped me like think about art in general in a very different way, and of course informed my writing.
Yeah, when you were talking about kind of being aware of the edges, the things at the edges and the spaces in between, that's fascinating. Particularly because that's often where I guess the magic is as well, for the reader, and also maybe in terms of what you're leaving out, the sort of the in the process. But and it also kind of resonates with MONSTRILIO, and I think for me anyway, with the, and I don't have it right here, but something about the ending and the way you phrase it. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I think I mean, it's a balance, right? And I think about this constantly. It's like you want people to know enough so that they're not lost, at least for me, but not too much that they are just bored, because you're just like telling them everything, and there's no space for them to kind of like exist within the world you've created.
And also just the sort of the I think it was Molly Templeton wrote an essay recently for Reactor, where she was talking about just sort of allowing yourself to be confused, and the sort of the kind of rewards or the pleasures that can come from reading when you just don't know, and
yes,
that's good.
Yes, it is. I mean, I love that idea of like letting yourself be confused and kind of like having patience, and also like while writing, to allow, like I have to constantly tell myself that it's okay to be confused as well, even though it's kind of annoying sometimes, just because you're like, oh, I just want to know everything that I need to know to write this, right? But a lot of it is just working through confusion. Right.
In that interview with Emily Everett, you were discussing your story, Iceberg Mine, which is wonderful, weird, and very much like, wholly unique. I think I think one of the blurb quotes for MONSTRILIO is also wholly unique. But Iceberg Mine, your short story, is full of tremendous images and insights, and there's one part right at the beginning we talking about kind of sort of crossing between spaces and sort of the fantastical. And I think this is wonderful, where the narrator is waiting to meet Izyaki, I think it is.
Izyaki, yeah.
Izyaki, and first sees him, and you write in the story, he wore a black logoless baseball cap. His face was wrapped in a dark grey scarf, and his eyes were covered by vintage leather and brass aviator goggles, like a creature from a comic book. And there's this wonderful kind of moment where you kind of realize as a reader that you're kind of you're standing in JFK Arrivals, and there's this kind of guy coming off this plane, looking like sort of someone out of a comic book or someone out of some kind of fantasy. And then you have you have the narrator comment on how, well, he must have changed somewhere between immigration and coming to see me, because the US would never have let him in without showing his face, which I thought was I think in that little bit of that story, it kind of has that sort of weird and that sort of kind of confusion that you do really well, and also the humor that I think you do really well. You have a great sort of a great sort of sense of humor through what I've read of yours.
Oh, thank you. I like that. I mean, I think I love that my humor is coming out, because sometimes I feel like sometimes I go into sad places,
Right.
especially with MONSTRILIO, and I didn't want it to be just like a really heavy, really super dark thing that you can't even breathe. So I think like for me, humor is super important, just to kind of like give readers a break and kind of like a space to breathe, and kind of like just like be like, okay, not everything is horrible in the world, you know?
Right. Did you, I mean, writing MONSTRILIO, did you find yourself needing to take a break?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think also when I write, I don't know, when I write certain scenes, the humor just comes out naturally, maybe as a reaction because I just need it, or just because I like silliness too. I think silliness, it has like a very important place in all sorts of work. And so I think for me, it's important just for my practice to kind of like just have fun in those moments, and kind of like see if I can stretch silliness within something that might be a little bit more serious or whatever. And yeah, I mean, it's definitely like also a break for me, because I don't think anybody exists just in a space of depression. I mean, like, you know, forever. I mean, of course there's like depression, and a lot of people go through that, right? But there's also moments of levity, right? And I think living, it's part of like the combination of all those things.
Mm-hmm. When you sort of started, when you started writing, were you writing short stories first, or did you have sort of ambitions to write a novel first?
I started writing short stories first. When I started writing in high school in Spanish, in like in an after school like creative writing workshop, and I loved it, and it was just so much fun. And I think at that time, I like in my mind, writing a novel was something that you should do later, and so I started writing then, and then I decided to go into film and photography. So I stopped writing seriously until years later, when I started writing short stories again. And that's how I got into an MFA program in Michigan, in the University of Michigan, because I wanted to go back to being an artist. And I decided to go back to my first passion, which was writing. And so, yeah, I started writing short stories. I thought it was a more like manageable thing to do,
right,
to kind of see the end. And then while I was in my master's, my MFA, I started the novel, because I was like, well, I guess this is the space to do it now. And it's so hard to write a novel. I mean, it's hard to write short stories too, but a novel is just like such a big thing. But I kind of just like said, well, if other people can do it, why can't I? So I just gave it a try.
That's a very good way to approach it. Before we get to the novel, your story Jeremy in Barrel House, was that one of your earlier stories, sort of published or written, or like where does that fit into?
Yeah, it was published later, but it was an earlier. I mean, that story I wrote still on my MFA. It's not the early Iceberg. The Iceberg one, I think, came before that one when I wrote it, or around the same time, maybe. Because at that time I was working on several stories. But yeah, it's probably concurrent with the Iceberg one, but the Iceberg one got published first.
Okay. There's something about the language in Jeremy is particularly kind of interesting. There's sort of it's lithe, it's sensual. It's a really, again, it's one of those stories where the readers sort of at the edge of kind of knowing and not knowing, and it's it's really great for that. And it also just it's one of those stories that I'd like to hear. It has that kind of quality to it.
Yeah.
And it also has monsters, and it has this line kind of, no, we're monsters, but never always monsters. And I think that's kind of, I think the way you kind of play with that line, the way you kind of have always monsters sort of hyphenated unhyphenated then hyphenated.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a real sort of, you seem to have the sort of attention to kind of the symmetry there, and also to just the way that words can be kind of toyed with a little bit.
Yeah.
I think in that story. And I wonder kind of what does Jeremy mean to you?
I love the playfulness of the language in that story. I really like when I wrote it, I was just trying to experiment with language more than anything. And then it became like kind of like a little story, but I kind of wanted to see just how it would sound before, for like, how would a monster sound, or like a zombie-ish type monster sound who is losing language.
Right.
And I also love George Saunders and like the different voices he writes in, which is, to me, it seems very free and fun and amazing. And I think it was like an exercise in trying something like that, where it's very voicey and kind of like just immersed in language and playing with that. And I think I'm still interested in that, but sometimes I kind of like, maybe I'm too scared to kind of like go fully into it. With Jeremy, I was just like, well, if this works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. It's a very short story. And so it didn't matter if, like in the end, if it was like too crazy or too bonkers or whatever it was. And so, but I'm still interested in playing with that. And I think sometimes what like smooths that over in other stories or in my novels or whatever, it's maybe a fear of like just being too out there, or like it would seem like too contrived or something. And so, but I love the playfulness, so maybe I'll be more confident later in doing it more. I don't know, but I love the play of it.
Yeah, it works really well in that story, and it doesn't seem contrived. It seems very, very much like you're inhabiting that sort of, yeah, you inhabit that voice, and I think it works. So yeah, more playfulness. But is that something with Monstrilio you were grappling with as well? That sort of that kind of to and fro between, maybe not sort of experimentation strictly, but just that to and fro between how many risks do I take? Or
yes, yeah, I think even at the beginning, my first draft didn't even have a monster. It just had like a very troubled child.
Okay. That's interesting.
because I think I was afraid in my mind, also because I came here and everything that we were reading and like everything that in my mind was valuable at the time or seemed valuable at the time was very like realist fiction. And so I got in my head, even though I like grew up reading like magical realism and all sorts of other stuff, I think I got in my head and I was like, a novel has to be more realist, right? And then after that first draft, after that first draft, I knew something was missing. And then once I made the monster a monster, like an actual monster, then everything kind of like flowed, and it was like, well, yeah, this is actually what I want to write, and like my voice and all of that. But it took that step of confidence to be like, yeah, you can write anything you want, there's no literature police, at least when you're writing. Obviously, like publishing and all of that becomes an obstacle later, maybe. But I don't think one should be thinking about that while we're writing, right? Because otherwise it just becomes tepid and boring, right? Like a cookie cutter thing of everything else that exists. But it does take confidence, or at least it took confidence for me, or like just like working up that bravery to kind of be like, write what you want to write instead of what you think you should be writing. So yeah, there was a lot of grappling with that and language and what I could get away with and what I couldn't get away with.
Monstrilio was first published in the US by Zando last year,
yes,
2023, and Dead Ink is publishing a paperback of it this year. I think it came out last Tuesday or Thursday.
Yes, it did.
So by the time you're listening to this, it will definitely be out, and it's sort of told in four. The blurb has, let me read from the blurb. It says, Monstrilio is a novel told in 4 acts that spans the globe from Brooklyn to Berlin, a cathartic and precise portrait of being human. And I wonder kind of how, I mean, it's been out in the world now. How do you describe this amazing, very special novel? What do listeners need to know about it?
I don't know. I think a lot of it is tricky. I mean, I would love for listeners to take a chance with it and without knowing so much about it, because I think, or at least I've heard from other people or readers that have enjoyed it, that one of the things that they've enjoyed most is going into it without knowing exactly what was going to happen, or like the turns it takes. But yeah, I mean, I think for me, in the end, what I was writing toward was the question of whether love can stretch enough without breaking, even if you're a monster, if like the people that love you can still keep loving you. So I think that's for me what was like the spark.
That's enough of a tease, and I think going into it without knowing too much is definitely a good thing. And I don't want to talk too much about the sort of the kind of nitty gritty, but there is near the beginning you talk about there's a sort of passage revolving around the dogwood tree.
Yes.
Cornejo Florida.
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, my terrible pronunciation.
No, you're good.
And you write this gem. I liked the tree's resistance to make sense. This is the narrator's line, and I love that idea. It kind of sort of speaks a bit to what you were talking about before about being confused or allowing things to. Allowing a story to resist making sense. And I kind of wonder, was that kind of moment, was that sort of image in there from a very early stage, or did it come in later?
That image was there from an early stage. That was one of the first images, which is interesting that you bring that one up, because now that I hadn't thought of that line in a long time, but I mean, now that you say it, and hearing someone else speak it, it kind of makes sense to me. And also, I think it's just more beautiful when other people say it. But yeah, I think it was there just because, and also kind of like a sort of like, I don't know, like a soothing thing, or like something that I could tell myself that not everything has to make sense for it to be fascinating or for it to have value.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sort of like meta-textual. It's sort of
exactly
the author telling themselves, yeah, it's okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, for sure.
That's great. Without sort of like specifics of the structure, there is this 4-part structure, and and you've mentioned that there wasn't the monster originally when you started writing it. What was there always that kind of? Did you always want to have sort of multiple perspectives?
Yes, so the first draft wasn't structured as as strictly, let's say, as those 4 parts. It kind of jumped around a little bit more. Those 4 parts came in a little bit later, but it was always told from multiple perspectives. And I think that was because I was interested in family dynamics. And one of the things that interests me about families is that sometimes families have like their own like internal functioning and lore. Like they kind of like within the outside world, outside of that family, they sometimes function as a unit, right? And they know, like, maybe they have their own words for little things or their own little games or something like that. But within that family, there's also like individuals, right? And they see similar events that happen to a family differently. And I was really interested in that even though they might continue as a unit, especially like in a close-knit family, they still have like their own takes and their own individuality, and they see things from different perspectives. And they also have their own needs and their own desires that don't necessarily have to do with the family itself. And so that's why I was interested in like portraying the different perspectives.
And you've also said that it's sort of it's a novel with queer characters, and you've I forget the way you phrased it, but you said something like and the way it's written is queer. The sort of maybe the narrative structure is. Could you kind of sort of like go into that a little bit more, because I think that's really, really interesting as well.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I fully achieved it, but at least I tried, so that the narrative itself would be queered in some way, so that it wouldn't be like the most traditional narrative or like the most traditional arc, right? Of like, you start with one conflict and then you resolve it by the end, which in a way you could say like the book does work in that way in some ways. But there are other elements, and each character has their own arc, and there has their own like way of dealing or like moving around in this world. And so I tried to kind of just not only having queer characters, but also for the structure and the way it like moves forward to be a little different, so that it would also be queer in that way, that it would not be like the traditional way that you would understand how a story moves forward. So that was in my mind when I was writing, so that would also be part of that queerness, or but yeah.
Well, no, you talking about it there. No, I think all of that falls into place, and I think people, I mean, go out and find it. I mean, if you're even slightly intrigued listening to any of this, MONSTRILIO is out now. Now you've kind of lived with MONSTRILIO out in the world for a year, and you kind of mentioned how hearing parts of it read by someone else is a beautiful thing. Has your relationship to the book kind of changed? Have you? I know some writers, they sort of finish and then the story gets pushed sort of to the background. It's sort of they don't want to kind of return to it. But has your kind of understanding of it or your relationship with it altered, since it came out?
Yeah, it's become like something that is not totally mine anymore. I mean, I remember when I was writing it and living with these characters for a long time. And just thinking they were like, I was part of it, or like they were so mine, or like it was a very closed world. I was in with these characters and writing the novel. But now that it's out and it's like, and people talk about it, and they, whether good or bad, they have their own opinions or their ways to relate to these characters. And like the things that they get out from it, it kind of like becomes its own thing. So I know I wrote it, but it's kind of like it just grew out of on its own. Like now that it's out in the world, it's like its own thing. And so it feels less mine, weirdly, like it has gained something from being out in the world that is not, obviously it's not controlled by me, but it's also not something that I necessarily put into it, you know, like people are adding on to it what they want to add on to it. And so that just enriches it, but it enriches it on its own, independent of me, which is very interesting. And it's also good in the way that I don't have to go back to it, because I mean, I'm so glad it's done. I loved writing it, but it was hard to, and it is what it is. And now I can move on, type thing. And I'm glad like people are responding to it positively. But I like literally I can't do anything else. Like it's not like I could change the book, right?
It's there. It's out.
Yeah, it's out.
Gabino Iglesias wrote about how your work has classic horror DNA. He mentions Stephen King's Pet Sematary.
Yeah.
He mentions the humor of films like Little Shop of Horrors, and he also wrote about how your writing is part of a growing movement of writers like Carmen Maria Machado, Stephen Graham Jones, and Eric LaRocca, who, and this is quoting him, writers who wring fresh interpretations out of horrors, insights into otherness, expanding the genre to include BIPOC and LGBTQ plus characters, as well as their culture and their background. Is that sort of like, does reading that kind of review just sort of, you know, energize you?
Absolutely. I mean, and those people he mentioned, they're people that I've read a lot too. And it's, you know, like work that I love, and to be put in the same context as them is just so honoring. And it was just so great, a great feeling to read that, and also just to keep going, to be like, oh, well, maybe I don't completely fail at this, you know? And so, I think in working within like something that is challenging previous norms or something like that is also very inspiring. And so, I mean, it's just great to read that and to feel that even if in a small way, I can be part of that tradition,
right,
or like new tradition or disruption or whatever it is.
Disruption or wave. I wrote down that there's this incredible kind of wave of Latin American horror, and kind of I wonder sort of like how. Yeah, you sort of, where do you place yourself in the movement, and sort of what kind of thoughts do you have on that wave, sort of just generally?
So, I mean, I just love that there is so much interest right now in Latin American horror. And I think, I mean, this wave of people, I think it's also getting a lot of interest within English-speaking countries or places, which is interesting because I wrote MONSTRILIO in English originally, but a lot of these people are writing in Spanish, right? Like they're in their countries and they're just writing, you know, in Spanish, like one would do. And so, but a lot of these books have been translated and have been so well received here, or in other English-speaking countries, and that is really cool. And it also speaks to me of this, or at least to me. I mean, I'm not a scholar. Like I couldn't like trace every tradition or like, you know, pull that apart as meticulously. But I think in my head it works. Coming from that like more magical realist tradition, from writers in our countries that kind of wrote like years ago in that way, to kind of like take horror in like a lot of ways, which is like influenced with like Hollywood type horror or like those type of things, or like more like horror like Stephen King or things like that, and kind of like mixing it all together in this way that kind of exists within like a very particular mix of Latin American tradition and also like pop culture influences and American-ish like horror traditions. And so all of that combined like makes for like a very rich thing to be writing with. And there's like people that write it more personally, you know, like use horror more for personal stories, or like Mariana Enriquez, who uses it also like within like a families and stuff like that, but also to kind of like talk about like political things going around, you know, like and history and stuff like that, which sometimes can also be horrific, right? And so horror kind of like really embodies that place. And so I think it's just great, and I think it just kind of like a different way of thinking about horror. Also because I mean, I can't say for sure, but I don't think most of these writers are like thinking, I'm going to write horror and then think of the story. I think a lot of them might be thinking like, I want to write this story and it has horror just because I'm influenced by it, or there are elements or tropes that I'm interested in, and so I use them, which is really interesting to me, right? Because it's not like a thing of like, oh, I need to follow this formula. It's rather like how to use elements that I'm interested in to kind of convey this story, or kind of like use just like render this within with those elements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as you sort of were writing Monstrilio, what kind of influences, you know, which writers were kind of on your mind, or which writers do you think sort of you had this phrase, the sort of that every book you read leaves a little crumb in you, which is a great way of putting it. You know, sort of which crumbs sort of which were kind of, you know, around as you were sort of, you know, as you were writing Monstrilio and as the horror was kind of, you know, going into Monstrilio.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, I mean, from way back when, I love Julio Cortázar and his short stories, even though they're not horror necessarily, or like steeped in that tradition. And they're also like older. I think like the way he just uses like weird elements, or just fantastical elements, I was always influenced by that. And so kind of like that infusion of realism, and which is magical realism, but like in a different way, like maybe like a more incisive way, and also like more contemporary, just like Carmen Maria Machado and her short stories, which are amazing, and kind of also like use like folklore and myths and things like that to kind of like tell new stories. I love that idea. Or Kelly Link, and yeah, I mean, or even like the humor in Edgar Carrett's short stories, which I mean, I love that. And also kind of like this wacky sensibility, which I love. Also kind of like, obviously, Mariana Enriquez and her short stories. And even though I like Our Share of Night, I read after Monstrilio, but I think there's a lot to that's there, kind of like, you know, similar interest maybe. Also Samantha Schreblin, Fever Dream. That's a wonderful book. And I just love that book. And so all these people that are kind of writing within that space, or Amparo Davila and her short stories, which are just bonkers and like very unique. I mean, everything like that. Or Jonas Aka, I think, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I think it's called his collection After the Sun. It was so like the way he writes, just the prose and like the way like weirdness kind of like seeps in without explanation. It's really inspiring to me as well. And so like a bunch of people, and I think all those crumbs kind of like start bubbling up, whether consciously or not consciously, right? When you start writing.
Yeah. Yeah, and sort of more recently, what's kind of been on your mind? What have you been reading that's that you can kind of recommend to INTERZONE listeners?
Yeah, well, last year I read a wonderful book called Uranians by Theodore McCombs. I mean, I just love it. It's short stories and a novella, and it's queer, and it talks a lot about queerness, but in like a sci-fi kind of way, which is wonderful. And so it's just like the combination of those two things, which I really find lovely and fascinating. I'm in. I love Pemi Aguda, who's also a friend of mine, but her book just came out and her stories are fantastic, and they're set in Lagos, Nigeria, and they're fantastical and horrific, some of them, and just weird and lovely and so smart. And so I would definitely recommend that. I mean, yeah, there's a lot out there. I haven't been reading a lot this year because I'm writing my second book, and when I write, I don't read a lot. I feel like it kind of like interrupts because I just, especially if it's a good book, I just want to write that book instead of my book. So it just kind of like skews my perspective, because it's like, I kind of just want to be like, oh, why are they so good? Why can't I be like them? And so I try not to read that much. But yeah, I mean, those are some of the books. Also, I read this book, but I'm going to forget. It's called In the Shadows by Juan Jose Millas, I think his name is. Let me Google it really quick. It's called From the Shadows by Juan Jose Millas. So I wasn't that off. And it's a book from, well, I don't know when it was published, but it's Spanish book. I think the translation was published in 2016, but I can't remember exactly when like the original book came out. But it's a wonderful, weird book about this guy that he tries to shoplift something in a bazaar, and then he gets caught and he gets chased, and so he like hides in like a dresser, an old dresser, and then they buy that dresser, and so he lives in this house inside the dresser and looks at and just kind of spies on the family's dynamic.
That's wonderful.
It's weird and funny and dark.
And that's and 2016 is the translation.
Yeah, I think so. But yeah, he's a Spanish author. But yeah, and I love that book. And it's a short book, and also I'm interested in shorter books, like short novels, because it kind of like they kind of pack a punch. But it's almost like a different form than a like longer novel where it can span more time or more things. But yeah, I'm always fascinated by like shorter novels and how they pack so much punch in that space.
Did MONSTRILIO always sort of exist around the sort of similar length, or was it kind of longer and then shorter?
No, it actually existed in basically the same length throughout. yeah, it was never too much shorter or much longer. So yeah, and I think in my mind, like with this next project, I think in my mind it's like, oh, it's gonna be shorter, but I don't know if it's gonna be shorter.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's not something that you can completely like plan. I don't think.
Predict at the beginning.
Yeah.
The Pemi Aguda collection is Ghost Roots, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yes, Ghost Roots.
Yeah. I haven't. That's on my list of things. Uranians I have on the pile, but the Pemi Aguda, I sampled a PDF, and I was just kind of amazed at what I sort of read there. So I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to kind of reading that. That looks like a great collection.
It is. I think you will enjoy it a lot.
So MONSTRILIO is out, and you're doing some events this month, sort of July, if you're July 2024, if you're listening later.
Yes.
At Waterstones, at Blackwell's, and at Dead Ink Books in Liverpool.
Yes.
Are they remote, or are you heading to the UK?
I'm heading to the UK. I'm excited.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah. I'll be around.
Okay. So you can find links to all of those at your website, which is GerardoSámano Córdova.com.
Yes.
And you are on social media, the site formerly known as Twitter. You are Samanito.
Yes.
And on Instagram you are hello.samanito. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, people can find you there. So hopefully, and I'll add links in the notes. Yeah, I mean, is there anything else you want to add about maybe your next project? I'm always kind of reluctant to ask because I know sometimes people can't say very much, but if there's anything you want to kind of hint at or anything else you want to say about MONSTRILIO before we wrap it up.
I mean, I can't say a lot about the story, but I'm enjoying writing it. I think it's weird. And as I said before, I struggle with how much I can get away with, but I'm trying to kind of like let it be, let it go, and just see what happens. And I hope it'll be done soonish. But yeah, and I mean, I just want to say thank you for this wonderful interview. I loved talking about not only MONSTRILIO, but also my short stories. That was really, really cool to talk about as well. Thank you very much, Gerardo. It's been an absolute pleasure. I hope people will kind of check out your site. You've got links to the short stories that are kind of online, and in other places, and to the book, and MONSTRILIO. Yeah, pick it up. It's fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk today. No, thank you. This was wonderful. You've been listening to INTERZONE Pod with me, Gareth Jelley, the editor of INTERZONE, and my guest today, Gerardo Sámano Córdova. Find out more about INTERZONE at interzone.press and read stories for free at our online sister zine, INTERZONE Digital. Thanks for listening. See you next time.